Let's talk about affirmative action and the discussions at, I believe, the Supreme Court level of reversing or undoing. What impact do you think that might have?
I actually think it's not going to have much of an impact.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out what I was feeling when you asked that question.
Well, I
Uh,
caught you I caught you by surprise.
you're right, but it's a good question. Don't get me wrong. It's just that I have a problem with the term affirmative action first.
Okay.
As you know, I have a problem with many idioms. They tend to miscommunicate the true meaning,
Mm-hmm.
right? In this case, the term isn't miscommunicated, it's misapplied.
Okay.
And I don't understand why affirmative action only applies to actions that remedy past discriminations. In my mind, affirmative action is simply a description of an action. It simply says you meant to do this.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
It's misapplied.
Okay.
And I don't understand why affirmative action only applies to actions that remedy past discriminations. In my mind, affirmative action is simply a description of an action. It simply says you meant to do this.
Well, if you break it down into two separate words, affirmative to me is positive and action is movement. So theoretically, it should be a positive movement, which is more of a future-based movement, but it tends to respond to past-based.
I believe if you look it up, affirmative does not only mean positive. Affirmative means purposeful.
Okay.
And I submit that the slave codes were affirmatively done. They
Okay.
were affirmatively developed and affirmatively adopted and affirmatively enforced.
Okay.
And so I reject fervently and affirmatively the notion that affirmative action is a liberal tool. Okay. Now I realize I'm splitting hairs.
Right.
And I understand what people talk about. I understand what people think they mean when they talk about affirmative action. My problem is if you can affirmatively deny my rights, why can't I affirmatively reacquire them?
So let me give you some definitions because, as you know, I look things up. And affirmative, supportive, hopeful, or encouraging. So a supportive action, a hopeful action, or an encouraging action, or agreeing or consenting to a statement or request. So it's an agreeable action, a supportive action, a hopeful.
It didn't say agreeable, it said agreeing.
Okay, that's true. They didn't say agreeable because it may not be agreeable.
Right.
But it does say a statement of agreement.
Yes.
So.
And the slave code was a statement of agreement.
Okay. So affirmative action designed to eliminate unlawful discrimination, remedy the results of prior discrimination, and prevent such discrimination in the future.
That's a social definition.
Okay.
That's a definition that describes the use of the term when it was generated in the 60s.
Yes.
Before that, there was no, and so that's why my argument is mute, but I make the argument because in order to introduce the concept that there was an action before affirmative action.
Okay. There was action
and
in action.
Action was designed to mitigate a previous action.
Right.
Now, right now, the Supreme Court is reviewing the use of race in admissions in higher education.
Yes.
In their deliberations, the conservative judges pounded the the judges for representing Notre Dame and Michigan and University of Michigan, I believe, about when will we stop using race as a criteria for admissions. When Justice O'Connor wrote the majority argument that said that race could be used as a criteria for the good of society, she also wrote she didn't expect this to happen to last forever. And she estimated that maybe 25 years, in 25 years, we won't have to do this anymore. And now the conservative justices have decided that that 25-year was an accurate limit or a proposed limit. We're past 25 years now. They want a date. I think some justices actually want the 25 years to be the limit, and some of them want to say, I want to hear a date, that you're not going to do this anymore. I have no problems with Justice O'Connor suggesting we won't need this forever.
Right.
I have no problems with her estimating how long it might be. I think she was sorely naive about 25 years of doing this when we've been doing just the opposite for 200 or more. So I don't understand how anybody can think you can turn a society around that has been practicing race-based denials for 200 years, and all of a sudden, in less than a generation, you're going to change that behavior. And my problem is that we now have justices who are trying to hold to that with no regard to societal behaviors and human tendencies. But the answer isn't a date. I am glad that the lawyers got so befuddled they didn't offer one because they weren't expecting this question.
Neither were you.
Yeah, that's right. But the answer is obvious. The answer is we will stop it when attitudes have changed, when there's no more threat of reversing these actions.
And the first step seems to be the education reversal of using affirmative action in college. But to me, that's just a jumping off point.
But frankly, college is the end point of education. And frankly, higher ed it takes a lot longer for higher ed to have an influence on societal factors than any other. If we did this in elementary school, then I might be okay. But my point is that I think it's reasonable to say that we ought to at least wait a generation.
Well,
the problem with going past a generation is that those who want to make America great again might lose their children to a new vision of America.
We didn't wait a generation for Roe v. Wade either.
I know we may not have, but Roe v. Wade has been in place for 50 years.
Yes.
And that's been enough that we have children who have only known the freedom to exert decisions on their body.
Yes. Affirmative action was just, I think, 1978. That was, it wasn't that the case that came out of UC Davis?
I don't know.
Okay. So we're about 50 years on affirmative action as well. I mean, 1965 was really the first efforts and the starts of from a civil rights standpoint.
Yeah.
But the education thing, I think, started with a case out of UC Davis in the 70s.
Affirmative action doesn't just apply to education.
Right.
And by the way, the courts aren't looking at affirmative action right now. This case isn't about affirmative action. This case is about race-based admissions.
Okay. But it's being termed affirmative action.
By whom?
By everybody in the news, not necessarily by the courts.
Ah, okay. See, there we go again.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's, what sells is not race-based, it's affirmative action. The courts will.
Yeah, it's a coined phrase.
Yeah.
And once again, we take a hit on it.
Mm-hmm.
And the term itself suggests that we're going to give African Americans or people of color a special path into our colleges, even if it means being unfair to other people. And yet that was not the original court decision. The original court decision was race can be used as one of the criteria.
Mm-hmm.
Affirmative action was a little stronger than that. Affirmative action said that in some cases of egregious segregation, where you have historical perspective where you never hired a black cop in 50 years,
Right.
that in order to correct this situation, we may have to set up an affirmative action so that we don't have 1 or 2 cops hired every year for the next 10 years before we get equity. And we may have to harm some white applicants in order to protect society. But if the Black community is going to support the police department, then the Black community should feel that they're being represented in the police department, and they shouldn't have to wait another 50 years before they have enough police that look like them.
So, I mean, theoretically, if step one might be education, couldn't there also be efforts to change the mindset when it comes to hiring?
Who said step one was education, first of all?
Let's just say that that's what the feelings are regarding what the Supreme Court is doing right now, is that could be considered in the educational standpoint, but there's also, could it be then considered with respect to employment?
So I'm somewhat exasperated because, first of all, the Supreme Court looking at this case has nothing to do with whether or not this is step 1 or step 5.
Mm-hmm.
They're not even looking at it as whether or not education is a part of addressing the problem.
Right.
The reason they're looking at this is because somebody said that whites and Asians are being denied fair treatment because of the use of race as part of the admissions process. And because somebody said that there are enough Asians and enough whites already in the system, we're more likely to be denied, right? So this is not about education at all. This is about a grievance from 2 demographics to get in. But this is not about how to use education to settle this problem. That's not what they're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, what they're looking at is this a good solution to creating the next class, regardless of what the class is going to think? And so I want my right protected too. So it's that narrow a topic. But in answer to your other question, there are different aspects of societal injustice that we have to address. Mm-hmm. And employment and labor is another area we have to look at.
Right.
So let me go back to my police analogy. Or you can take the NFL, or you can take deans of colleges. If there are no Black, African American, or if there are very few Asians in a given labor market, then how long do you think you're going to have executives in that labor market that represent those demographics? If they have been systematically denied access to the labor market, because then the argument is, in the late 60s, the argument was, you know why there are no coaches, Black coaches in the NFL? Because they haven't been assistant coaches long enough yet. They don't have the experience. Right? And women are getting the same thing in the AVMA.
Mm-hmm.
You know why there are no women, until now? You know why women don't represent the student body in the board of AVMA? It's because they haven't been veterinarians long enough to understand the problems of the profession, so they don't really qualify to be president or to predominate in the board. Now, let's just ignore the fact that we wouldn't let them come to school 40 years ago, that it was a hostile environment for them 40 to 50 years ago. Let's ignore that. And now we're okay. We're going to let them in, but it's going to take time. And when they outnumber us naturally, they will predominate on the board. And then we'll have childcare right next to our veterinary practices. Or our veterinary practices will get together in a city and build a child care because they need it for their vet techs, because they now understand how to build a new business model that is socially responsive to their healthcare team. That's what affirmative action short circuits.
Yeah, well, we've seen in the last 12 months efforts to reverse laws, policies that both you and I grew up with. I mean, when Roe v. Wade was passed and when affirmative action in 1978 was passed or brought forward, and even the Civil Rights Acts in the mid 60s, we were still beginning to develop our understanding of how the world operates. So we've lived with these statements for the past 40 years or so. And I just keep going back to the question of, if it ain't broke, why fix it? Why change it? I can't get where the problems are that we need to undo what's been done.
Well, I don't accept that the problems were solved in Roe v. Wade.
Right.
And I think that is the crux of our problem, that both sides of the argument have oversimplified the argument. The only thing Roe v. Wade did was acknowledge the right of the human being to make their own healthcare decisions. And you've heard me say this before, this is a healthcare issue.
Right.
This is a public health issue. This is, I hate to put it this way, but this is similar to the death penalty issue. And unfortunately, we have conflated it with our moral value issue about life.
Mm-hmm.
And in both instances, whether it's abortion or death penalty for someone who's already alive and has has committed a crime, because right to lifers would say abortion is the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
But once again, we're playing games with words. And because we don't want to take this task head on, we won't give credence to anything. I'm amazed at how hard we fight for the Second Amendment so that we can carry guns, etc. And then we can abuse the First and try to take control of library boards so that certain books don't appear, or cancel people because of their rhetoric. We'd rather not hear it rather than consider it. Well,
what I wanted to do when I asked the question about affirmative action, which has gone into a variety of different, and we can move on, but is really just say that a courageous conversation is all about looking at topics that don't always get discussed and kind of dissecting them and thinking about them and understanding the implications and the unintended consequences that don't always get heard. So I asked the question with the thought in mind of just demonstrating how a topic can be used to institute and instigate and get a courageous conversation going that, sometimes we don't fully understand what we're going to get ourselves into. And sometimes by surprising the other person, you get to hear some things that are maybe a little bit less prepared. So I appreciate you taking this on head on, because there was a method to my madness.
Yeah, well, you're always mad. So I don't think you got anything different had I prepared,
Okay.
Only because I live in this world,
Right.
And I have experienced the butchery of language, the misapplication of intent, the malalignment of purpose, and the demonization of the other side. And all those things detract from a courageous conversation. The veracity of truth is critical. Now, one's truth is based on one's perspective, and I understand that, but denial is not perspective.
Right.
Head burying is not perspective. Censorship is not perspective. And if there's going to be a courageous conversation, there must be an absolute commitment to the First Amendment. At the same time, an absolute commitment to the First Amendment does not mean total freedom of speech. And that's where the line gets blurred. According to the Supreme Court decision, you don't get to yell fire in a movie house if there's no fire. If somebody gets hurt, you're liable. That's a long way away from the line that says, your experience makes me feel uncomfortable, so I don't want to talk about it.
Well, I do think that the topics that we've talked about today are going to continue to be on our radar screen as we continue these courageous conversations. And thank you, Phil, for letting me run over you with the bus and back it up over the top of you. I appreciate that.
One day I want to talk to you about Jackson.
Oh, I want to learn about Jackson.
I want to talk to you about water.
Let's talk about water. But in the meantime, there's a lot of water going under the bridge that we'll continue to talk about. And again, thank you to Nationwide for your support in allowing us to try to learn more about some of these issues that are out there and share ideas from that standpoint.
And thank you to the listeners.
Gus, so thank you, Phil. We'll catch up again soon.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.